there's also possibilities for you to influence what happens on the client side. So for instance, we're going to remove this rule now that we created, if I find it, that forces everything to be into one group for the database unavailable. And we're going to try to accomplish the same on the client. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my web project. And here I want to use a feature in the SDK called before send to influence what happens with an event. So you can at any point in time register a function called before send. And this works relatively the same in all SDKs, which gets two parameters. It gets the event, which is the event is about to be sent. And it gets an object called the hint object, which contains additional information you can use to influence the event. So for instance, you can say in Python that I want to check if the event was created from an exception. For that, you can look into this hints dictionary if there's an exception information in there. And you can say if there is exception information and the second value of the exception information is of type database unavailable, you can do something, right? So one of the things that you could do here is you could throw away the entire event. If you don't want to see database unavailable errors, just throw it away. Then you would just return none, and Sentry would never send these errors again. But that's not what you want to do here. We just want to change the grouping. So what you can do is you can basically go and modify the event. And in the same way as here, on the bottom, we send some fingerprint values database is down from a rule. We can do the same thing here. So we can say fingerprint is a list of values. In this case, we can say database is down, right? So we're going to do the same as here. We're going to save it. And we're going to reload our application. And now if we trigger this error again, let's see what shows up. So far, I haven't seen it. So now we saw it once. Let's see if it comes up again. We should see the same thing here now, where all of those errors go in to this one group. Let's see when it shows up. Right, so it's still in the same group. But this time, if you go to the details, you can see that it was hard-coded by the client SDK, right? So previously, we saw the rule that applied to change the fingerprint. In this case, the fingerprint was set by the client code. So we see no rule here that applied, but we can see the custom fingerprint that we configured. You can not only configure the custom fingerprint in a before send method, although for these types of errors, it's a very convenient way to do it. Another way, for instance, is to say, well, I want to reconfigure this here right away. So I could, for instance, say on scope. So this is an example where I configure the scope manually. I want to say set fingerprint, and then I can say JSON error, right? And if I do this, any exception flying in the duration of this block is going to be grouped by the string called JSON error. So I can demonstrate this again if I do just some errors here. Oh, actually, sorry, it's in Python, it's called fingerprint equals. If I do this, they're all going to go to the same group. So this is actually me misusing the SDK, so I don't have to keep this. Let's see when the event comes up. Right, so in this case, I don't actually, oh yeah, in this case, we can actually now see that both applied, both the server and the client. So in this case, you can see now that the server applied this rule and forced it into this group. In addition, we can also see that the client tried to send the JSON error fingerprint, but the server rule always overrides the client rule. So in this case, we can see the server rule won. And so what I did on the client didn't actually take any effect. But you get the idea. You can configure this both on the client and on the server. And depending on how you're going to do this, there are different ways in which you can see this. What I want to give you sort of as general recommendations of how you can use the system is the most annoying, I think, experience that people have when they use the product without thinking too much about grouping is if they have code that can error in many different ways. So this is particularly communication with external services, where the external services might legitimately cause failures. So for instance, if you have a system that sends out notification emails every morning on a cron job, and some of those mail sending activities fail in different types of errors, it's very common that if you just deploy the system to Sentry, you're going to get a bunch of different groups based on the different errors that you're going to experience. There are two ways in which you can go with this. One of them is like, okay, I don't want to see this at all, but that's kind of not great because then you don't know that something is failing and you still might want to monitor this. The other one is to force this to be in a consistent group. And when you force something in a consistent group, a lot of customers then think that there's no way for them to discover what's inside of this. So one way, as I showed you, is to use the tags feature to actually see the different types of things that fed into this. So for instance, here we can see like the different JSON files that caused this error to happen. But another way is actually to use a discover feature to do something similar. So for instance, here we can search for all of the event title. Let's see what we actually have. So we can do, it's just for database unavailable. So you can search here, for instance, and then you can, so in this case, I can't do it because actually on my project here, I'm not on a business plan. But if you are on a business plan, you can change the column rendering here, for instance, to break it down by a transaction, for instance. Then you can get a nice breakdown of what my database unavailability looks like. So for instance, maybe if I break it down by the server name, I see that one server is having more database unavailable errors than others. And so in that case, actually grouping this down consistently into one big group also helps you then fan it out into a good breakdown in Discover based on the different sort of areas in which you want to investigate why this error is happening. Likewise, if you do calls to external services, a good idea is to always attach a tag, which service it is. And then you can use, even if it's in a single group, you can use the Discover product to figure out which service is failing in how many ways.